Hello and welcome to Music and Art in the Catholic Tradition, Module 2, Lesson 2. Today we're going to be talking about the Summa Theologica of St. Thomas Aquinas. Specifically, we're going to be looking at whether or not he believes singing in church is allowed, and we're going to be looking at what is necessary for worship to be proportional in Aquinas' view. We're also going to look at what is necessary for religious art in order for it to be acceptable, according to Aquinas, appropriate for use in worship, and how we should approach it in worship. And then finally, we're going to be looking at what Aquinas believes beauty is. And if we have enough time, we'll also talk about what he believes is the appropriate approach to sensible knowledge. So we've got a lot to talk about. Let's dive right in. Being a student at the Catholic University of America, you've probably read something by Aquinas at this point in your career. That is because St. Thomas Aquinas, who was sainted relatively quickly after his death, only about 100 years or so, was incredibly influential on the entire, not just the thought of the Catholic tradition, but the entire life and culture of the Catholic tradition. So let's dive right in and see what he thinks of singing in church. Now, Aquinas always begins his questions with objections that he's then going to refute. So we won't spend a lot of time talking about the objections that he mentions here, although it is very worth noting that many of these objections, which who knows, maybe people were making them at the time, maybe he came up with them himself for the purpose of refutation. But in any case, many of these objections will come up again in the Renaissance and in the Baroque era. Aquinas argues here that the Bible indicates that we clearly should be singing in church. It's not just singing in our heart. We should be singing with our voices. He also says that it's not a problem that we have some mention of church fathers saying we shouldn't focus too much on the pleasure of music, because he says, of course we shouldn't focus too much on the pleasure of music. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't sing at all. Singing, when used appropriately, is a very important help to individuals in their devotion and in their connection to God. He writes in his reply to objection 5, "The soul is distracted from that which is sung by a chant that is employed for the purpose of giving pleasure. But if the singer chant for the sake of devotion, he pays more attention to what he says, both because he lingers more thereon, and because, as Augustine remarks in his Confessions, Book 10, 33, each affection of our spirit, according to its variety, has its own appropriate measure in the voice and singing, by some hidden correspondence wherewith it is stirred. The same applies to the hearers, for even if some of them understand not what is sung, yet they understand why it is sung, namely, for God's glory, and this is enough to arouse their devotion." And so, the quote that he takes from Augustine is directly leading back to Plato, that each affection of our spirit, each emotion that we have, has its own appropriate measure in the voice and singing, i.e. it has its own mode or its own way of singing that connects to it and stirs it up. So there's a type of music that's appropriate for devotion. It will stir up devotion. It will bring us closer to God. It will help us glorify God. And as long as we use that proper type of music, we will be fine. Now here's where we really get into the interesting meat of these excerpts, because that's all stuff that we've heard before about singing, who should, whether or not we should use it, how is it appropriate. It all goes back to proportion and so on and so forth. Well, what does he think the appropriate parameters are for proper worship? What is too much and what is too little? Well, his argument is really interesting. He says, that disproportion occurs when you have too little or too much of something according to the goal that you're directing it towards. So, in the case of worship, we can never have too much worship of God because God deserves more than we can ever give him. So, we only could be guilty of disproportion in terms of too little worship. But nevertheless, even though we can never worship too much, he says that there are some things, 5 requirements that worship must have in order for it to be proportional. It must conduce to God's glory. So it must be glorifying to God. It must raise minds to God. So it must put you in the proper frame of mind to consider and appreciate and glorify God. It should curb concupiscence. So it should take us away from or inhibit our sensual longings, our desire for food and to touch things we like to touch and to hear things we like to hear and to be lazy and so on and so forth. It should take us away from the earthly desires of our bodies and take us to a realm, a spiritual realm. It should also accord with the commandments of God and his church. So it must be fitting according to what's been laid out in the Bible and what's been practiced in the church. And interestingly enough, he also says it should not be contrary to general custom. So that means that even if something really glorifies God, if we're thinking theoretically, you have some practice that glorifies God more than anything else. If it were really contrary to the general practice, the general custom, then it might not be appropriate. Even though it fulfills one or more of the other requirements, general custom might inhibit its acceptance, according to Aquinas. So it must be something that is acceptable in the culture already, or that could be acceptable in the culture. Now turning to art. He's talking about specifically here Christ's image being adored with the adoration of latria. Now, latria means the adoration that we give to the Holy Trinity and members of the Holy Trinity. So there's an image of Christ. Should we adore that image? Because it's not him, it's just an image. Wouldn't that be idolatry? Some people might say that's idolatry. Now you can imagine how this has a really huge impact. This thought or this question has a huge impact on Christian art because pretty much all of our art in the Catholic Church and in the Christian world in general has to do with depictions of Christ, the apostles, angels, people from the Bible, scenes from the Bible. And if we are in danger of practicing idolatry when we adore, when we admire, when we sort of worship through these images, then that could be a big problem. And so the way he gets around this, he's refuting this idea that to adore Christ with latria is idolatry. He turns to Aristotle, or, as everyone says, the philosopher. And he says there's 2 things inherent in an image when we see it. There's the image itself, which is the physical thing. And then there's the thing, or you could think of the form, behind it. And that is different from the image. We conceive of the fact that it's an image, that it is material, put together to resemble something. But then there's something behind it that it resembles. And so he says, thus, therefore, we must say that no reverence is shown to Christ's image, as a thing, for instance, carved or painted wood, because reverence is not due save to a rational creature. It follows, therefore, that reverence should be shown to it insofar only as it is an image. Consequently, the same reverence should be shown to Christ's image as to Christ himself. Since, therefore, Christ is adored with the adoration of latria, it follows that his image should be adored with the adoration of latria. So we're not adoring the image itself, we are adoring Christ. the visage of Christ depicted in the image. And so Aquinas would therefore give a pass to all religious art that depicts, respectfully, of course, and in the proper context, Christ or, the Holy Spirit as a dove or something perhaps, the Blessed Virgin Mary and so on. Because we're not worshiping the image, we haven't set up a golden calf that we're bowing down to. It's not the golden calf we're worshiping. We're not even really worshiping the painting, in any case. We're thinking about contemplating and glorifying the thing behind that, the Holy Trinity or the Blessed Virgin Mary or the saints or angels or so on and so forth. And he finishes by saying, because in the New Testament God was made man, he can be adored in his corporeal image. So we can't make an image of God because God is transcendent of all images. But because Christ was made human, corporeal, we can know that image. We can appreciate and adore that image. Now I'm sure you could guess what beauty is for Aquinas. At this point in history, we've seen every author that we've read believe the same exact thing. So, or very, very similar. There's some discrepancy, of course, between Plato and Aristotle. But so if you were going to put money on it, you would probably go with him believing something about beauty that's very related to what Plato believes. And so what does Plato believe? Well, I'll leave you to ponder that, and let's talk about Aquinas. So, he writes that just as there are two kinds of bodily stain, one consisting in the privation of something required for beauty, e.g. the right color or the due proportion of members, and another by the introduction of some hindrance to beauty, e.g. mud or dust, so too a stain is put on the soul in one way by the privation of the beauty of grace through mortal sin, in another by the inordinate inclination of the affections to some temporal thing, and this is the result of venial sin. Now, he's talking about something else in this passage, but he's indicated what he believes is required for beauty. When something is absent, it can't be beautiful. And when something is added that is unnecessary, like dirt, that's the example he gives, mud or dust, then it's disproportionate, it's inaccurate, and it's not beautiful. More specifically, in another example, he says, the body's beauty is harmony of parts with a certain charm of color. And that he's quoting Augustine there. And it will be impossible for the glorified body to lack beauty, therefore the glorified bodies will not be lightsome. So what he's saying there, he's talking about whether or not, when we're made whole after the last judgment, whether or not we'll be bodies of light, or whether we will be our bodies, but better. And he says, it stands to reason that if the body's beauty is in its harmony and its proportion and a certain charm of color, then if you take away the color and we're just light, then we'll lack something that makes us beautiful. So we won't lack for color, we won't be lightsome, we'll simply be perfect. All the imperfections and the disproportions in us will be removed, and we'll be made perfect. And he goes on to say that the glory of the body will not destroy nature, but will perfect it. Thus we see bodies which have color by their nature aglow with the resplendence of the sun, or from some other cause extrinsic or intrinsic. So, light doesn't detract things that exist in a body, they only enhance them. They make them glow. So we might glow a little bit, but we won't be just completely bodies of light. And just like Augustine, he would say that beauty comes from God. He writes, now creatures lead to the knowledge of God chiefly by their comeliness and beauty, which shows forth the wisdom of their Maker and Governor. Wherefore it is written, by the greatness of the beauty and of the creature, the Creator of them may be seen, so as to be known thereby. And the beauty of the heavenly bodies consists chiefly in light. Wherefore it is written, the glory of the stars is the beauty of heaven. The Lord enlighteneth the whole world on high. Hence the heavenly bodies will be bettered, especially as regards their brightness. But to what degree and in what way this betterment will take place, is known to him alone who will bring it about. So beauty comes from God, and God is going to make us perfect. So we will be perfectly beautiful. And, the universe will be perfectly beautiful at that point. But it's impossible to know exactly in what ways it will change, because only God knows what perfect beauty is, because only God is beauty derives from God, and God is perhaps the only perfect beauty, or he has at least created the perfect beauty that lies behind all things, so only he can know. And later he writes, beauty or comeliness results from the concurrence of clarity and due proportion. So things must be clear and proportional. Clarity is a new one, right? We haven't heard someone say specifically that something needs to be clear. What might you think he means by that? He could perhaps mean clear in the sense that it has to be accurate in its representation of what it is, in which case then we've heard it before. But if by clear he means that all its members should be well defined and separate, or easily separatable, then perhaps that's something new. I'm not sure how I would come down on that. I think he might be referring to clarity as in distinctness of members. So, for example, you can't tell mud is sort of ugly because it's not really well proportioned, and you can't even tell if mud is well proportioned because you can't tell what its constituent parts are. It's just a goop. And yet a tree can be very beautiful because you can see and clearly define the differences between each member of the tree, and you can decide whether they are proportional to each other. So maybe that's one way, but I haven't decided exactly what I think about that. And of course he says again, hence the beauty of the body consists in a man having his bodily limbs well proportioned together with a certain clarity of color. Well, it looks like that's about all the time we have for this lesson, so we won't talk about sensible knowledge. That is Lesson 2 of Module 2. I look forward to discussing Aquinas and to discussing music and art with you in the discussion forum, and I will talk to you again in Lesson 3. Until then, have a good day wherever you may be.